I want to take you back to a time when my family was everything to me, a close-knit loving unit where respect and kindness were the foundation of every relationship. I'm a woman in my early 60s now, but for most of my life, I wore the proud title of mom with joy and pride. My son James was my world. From the moment he was born, I dreamed of the future we'd share, holidays filled with laughter, birthdays bursting with warmth, and quiet evenings where we talked about life like best friends. James was always a good boy, respectful, kind-hearted, and full of promise. I watched him grow from a curious little boy into a fine young man with a strong sense of responsibility. We had our ups and downs like every family, but nothing we couldn't work through. There was love between us, a bond one believed was unbreakable. When James told me he was getting married, I was over the moon. I wanted nothing more than to welcome a daughter into our family, someone who would love and care for James as I did. I imagined us all sitting around the dinner table, sharing stories, jokes, and plans for the future. I believed our family was about to grow stronger, not fall apart. Her name was Melissa. I remember the first time I met her. She was pretty, quiet, and polite. At least that's what I thought at first. I tried my best to make her feel welcome, inviting her over for family dinners and holidays. I even tried to find common ground, hoping we could build a good relationship. I told myself to be patient and kind. After all, blending families can be tricky and new relationships take time. But as the months passed, I started noticing subtle changes. Melissa seemed distant, almost cold at times. She wasn't warm or eager to join family activities. I chalked it up to nerves or maybe just her personality, but inside, I felt a small knot of worry tighten in my chest. Sometimes she'd barely look at me during conversations, and other times I caught her exchanging looks with James that made me uneasy. It was as if they were sharing a secret I wasn't part of. James, on the other hand, began to change too. The easygoing boy who once called me every day suddenly grew quieter and more withdrawn when Melissa was around. He started spending less time with me, and when we did talk, his tone was sharper, less patient. It was like something had shifted beneath the surface of our relationship, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore the feeling. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But deep down, I sensed that the harmony we once had was beginning to crumble. The warmth I used to feel in our home was slowly being replaced by an uncomfortable chill. I remember one evening sitting alone in my favorite chair by the window, looking out at the street where James and Melissa lived. The house that once felt like a place of joy now seemed foreign to me, like I was an outsider looking in. I thought about all the memories we'd shared, birthdays, holidays, simple Sunday dinners, and I wondered where. It had all gone wrong. I missed my son, the real James, the boy who used to laugh freely and hug me without hesitation. But more than that, I missed the family we once were, the closeness, the respect, the love. Now, as I tell you this story, I'm haunted by those early days when the cracks first appeared. They were small at first, a cold look here, a dismissive word there, but they grew into something much darker and painful, something I never expected from my own son. This is the story of how a loving mother was pushed to the edge, how betrayal came from the people she trusted most, and how one act of cruelty changed everything. I hope by sharing this with you, you'll understand the pain behind family conflict, how even the strongest bonds can be tested and sometimes broken, but also how strength and dignity can rise from the deepest wounds. Because what happened next was something I never saw coming, and it changed my life forever. I still remember the day James brought Melissa home for the first time like it was yesterday. I had spent hours cleaning the house, baking her favorite dessert, chocolate cake I'd learned from one of her few Instagram posts, and setting the dining table just right. I wanted everything to be perfect. After all, this was my chance to make a good impression on the woman who would soon become part of my family. When the doorbell rang, my heart was pounding. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find James standing there hand in hand with Melissa. She looked beautiful in a simple but elegant dress, her dark hair pulled back neatly. She smiled politely, though there was something distant in her eyes that I didn't understand then. "Mom, this is Melissa," James said, beaming with pride. "We want you to meet her properly." I reached out and gave Melissa a warm hug, trying to hold on to the hope that she would feel like family. I said, "Welcome to our home, Melissa. I'm so glad you're here." She smiled again, a little tighter this time, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. It's lovely to meet you." I caught the slight hesitation in her voice. It wasn't cold exactly, but it lacked the warmth I'd hoped for. Still, I told myself to be patient. Maybe she was just shy or nervous. New beginnings are hard, after all. We all sat down to dinner, and I tried my best to keep the conversation light and friendly. I asked about her job, her family, and interests, eager to find something we could bond over. James was glowing, telling stories about their courtship, their shared dreams, and plans for the future. But Melissa remained quiet, answering my questions with short, clipped sentences. When I reached out to offer her some of my homemade mashed potatoes, she pulled back slightly, as if unsure whether to accept. I caught a faint look of discomfort on her face, but she said nothing. Later that evening, after James and Melissa left to go home, I sat in the quiet house and replayed the night over in my mind. I told myself it was normal for someone to take time to warm up to a new family. I was ready to give her all the time and space she needed, but then came the first small signs that something was off. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Melissa barely looked at me during family gatherings. She spoke in a tone that was polite but distant, like she was going through the motions rather than genuinely engaging. One time, when I complimented her on the dinner she'd brought over, she just nodded and said, "Thank you," without making eye contact. There was an unmistakable coolness in her demeanor, a subtle dismissal that stung more than outright rudeness would have. It was as if she was carefully keeping me at arm's length, silently drawing a boundary that I wasn't allowed to cross. At first, I tried to overlook it. I reminded myself that blending into a new family can be awkward, especially for a young woman who probably wanted to make a good impression on her in-laws. I kept inviting her over for tea, sending little notes of encouragement, and asking James to pass on my well wishes. But the more I tried, the more I felt like I was walking on eggshells around her. One afternoon, I went to their house to drop off a casserole I had made. Melissa answered the door and barely glanced at me before stepping aside to let me in. As I entered, I noticed the cold, minimal decor, not a single family photo in sight. The atmosphere was sterile, unfriendly. Trying to break the ice, I asked, "How are you settling in? Need any help with anything?" She gave a tight smile and said, "We're fine, thank you." Her tone was polite, but it carried a sharp edge that made me want to retreat. I felt invisible, like a stranger in my own son's home. That's when I started hearing whispers from neighbors and family friends, little things Melissa said behind my back, sarcastic remarks about how I meddled or was too old-fashioned. I brushed it off at first, unwilling to believe someone I was trying so hard to accept could be so cold. But the cracks were widening, and I could feel the tension growing like a storm gathering on the horizon. Still, I held on to hope, a desperate hope that beneath the cold exterior, Melissa might just be hurting or scared, that one day she'd let her guard down and welcome me as family. Looking back now, I see those early days as the calm before the storm. The signs were there, the cold glances, the quiet dismissals, the whispered words behind closed doors. But I didn't want to see them. I wanted to believe in the family I once knew. I was wrong. What happened next changed everything. It wasn't just coldness or distance anymore. It became something darker, something I never imagined could come from my own son's wife. But that I'll tell you about next. After those early cold interactions, things only grew worse between Melissa and me. The warmth that had once filled our family gatherings slowly drained away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier every time we were in the same room. It wasn't just Melissa's chilly attitude anymore, it was like a wall. There was a rising tension between me and my son, and I didn't know how to climb over it. At first, I tried to keep things normal. I called James regularly, asking about his day and sharing little stories about my garden or the neighbors. But the conversations grew shorter and less frequent when Melissa was around. James's usual easygoing tone tightened into something cautious and guarded. Sometimes he would hang up abruptly or avoid answering my calls altogether. I could feel him slipping away, and it tore me apart. Melissa's influence over him was clear. She began to set the tone for what was acceptable and what wasn't in our family. If Melissa didn't approve of something, James would quietly agree with her, even if it meant turning away from me. It was like she held the strings, and he was just following her lead. One afternoon, I invited both of them over for dinner. I wanted to bridge the gap, to remind them that family meant more than control or grudges. I spent hours preparing their favorite dishes, hoping to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere. But when they arrived, Melissa barely glanced at me, her arms crossed as if she were bracing for a battle. James looked uneasy, shuffling his feet and avoiding eye contact. During dinner, every attempt I made to engage Melissa was met with monosyllabic answers or polite deflections. She wouldn't talk about herself or her interests. Instead, she redirected every question back to James or stayed silent. It felt like I was invisible, a ghost in my own son's home. After that night, the invitations stopped. I wasn't included in their plans anymore. When I asked James about visits, he'd give vague excuses or say they were busy. I could see the unspoken message: I was no longer welcome. The most painful part was watching my son change. The boy who used to run into my arms now kept his distance. The man who once confided in me now shut me out. I missed him fiercely, but I also felt helpless and alone. I tried reaching out to Melissa directly, hoping to find some common ground. I sent her notes with small gifts, invited her for coffee, and even asked James to arrange a casual lunch between us. But each effort was met with polite refusals or no response at all. It felt like I was fighting an invisible enemy, one I couldn't name, but whose presence was suffocating. Melissa didn't just distance herself from me, she was actively isolating James from his family. She controlled what he said, where he went, and who he spent time with. I heard from relatives that she discouraged him from visiting me alone or attending family events without her. Slowly but surely, she was cutting me out of my son's life, piece by piece. The silence between us grew louder with every passing day. The respect I had once thought was unbreakable turned into a cold void where no words could reach. I found myself sitting alone in my quiet house, clutching old photographs and memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember crying quietly one night, the ache in my chest so deep. I thought it might break me. How could my own son, the boy I raised with love and sacrifice, be pulled so far away by a stranger? How had I become the unwelcome outsider in the very family I had built? That pain, that crushing loneliness, was almost unbearable. And yet, even in the darkest moments, a tiny spark inside me refused to die. I knew I had to hold on, not just for myself, but for the son I loved. I had to find a way to break through the walls Melissa had built, to remind James of who we were and what family truly means. But little did I know, the worst was yet to come. I still remember the exact moment everything started to unravel. It wasn't a grand argument or a dramatic fight. No, it was something much smaller, but it hit me like a slap across the face, an insult disguised as a careless comment. That moment was the first real crack in the facade, the beginning of a painful journey I never expected. It happened during a family gathering at my house. I had invited James and Melissa over for Sunday lunch, hoping to recapture some of the warmth we once shared. The kitchen was filled with the smell of roast chicken and fresh bread. The table was set with my best china, and I was hopeful the day would be different, that maybe, just maybe, we could find some peace. But the moment Melissa walked through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. She barely smiled and didn't offer a greeting. I greeted her warmly, but she barely acknowledged me. I brushed it off, telling myself to stay calm and keep the atmosphere light. As we sat down to eat, conversation was stilted. James seemed distracted, and I noticed the way Melissa's eyes narrowed whenever I tried to join in. Then, out of nowhere, she said it. "You don't have to try so hard, Melissa said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Nobody expects you to keep up with the times. Maybe you should just stick to what you're good at, cleaning and cooking." The words landed like a hammer. I froze, my hands tightening around my napkin. A deep sting of humiliation and anger rose inside me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say a word, I looked at James. He was silent, his eyes darting between me and Melissa, his face tight with discomfort, but he said nothing. The silence in that moment was deafening. His refusal to stand up for me, his own mother, hurt more than any insult Melissa could have thrown. Melissa smirked slightly, clearly pleased with the reaction she'd provoked. I felt the room grow colder, the warmth I'd hoped for evaporating like mist. I wanted to say something sharp to defend myself, to remind her that I was his mother, not a servant, but I stopped. I took a deep breath, swallowed the lump in my throat, and forced a smile. "It's okay," I said quietly. "I'm happy to help with what I can." But inside, a battle raged. I wanted peace. I wanted to keep my family together. But how could I when I was being disrespected so openly and my son stayed silent? After lunch, James quietly thanked me for the meal, but quickly I made an excuse to leave. Melissa followed without a word. I stood in the doorway watching them walk away, not just from my house, but from the family I'd tried so hard to keep whole. That night, I lay awake replaying the moment over and over. How had we gotten here? When did love turn into coldness and silence? I questioned myself. Had I done something wrong? Was I too old-fashioned? Was I somehow to blame? But the truth was, it wasn't me who had changed. It was Melissa's attitude and James's unwillingness to defend me that shattered what little peace remained. The incident marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with tension, silent resentment, and growing distance. I realized then that my son's wife wasn't just indifferent. She was deliberately trying to undermine me. I felt torn. I wanted to protect my son from conflict, but I couldn't ignore the way I was being treated. I was caught between the desire for family harmony and the need for respect and dignity. That day, I began to see the real Melissa, not the polite young woman who once shyly stepped into our home, but someone who viewed me as an obstacle, a nuisance, maybe even a threat. The worst part was knowing that James was watching it all unfold and choosing silence. That silence spoke volumes, louder than any words. I knew then that things were about to get much harder, but I also knew I couldn't stay quiet forever. Something had to change. I never thought the day would come when my own son would raise his hand against me. The idea was unthinkable, unimaginable, something I only ever heard about in the worst stories. But there I was, standing in my living room, stunned and shaking after James hit me. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, or at least it started that way. James and Melissa had come over unexpectedly. I wasn't prepared, but I welcomed them as I always did, hoping to keep the peace. I greeted Melissa politely, though I could tell right away her mood was sour. James seemed tense, like he was waiting for a fight to start. We sat in the living room, and I tried to make small talk, but Melissa was sharp and cold in her answers. Then somehow, the conversation turned to something I said in passing, a comment about Melissa's cooking that I thought was innocent and even complimentary. I told her gently that sometimes my grandmother's recipes brought out flavors you just can't find in takeout. But Melissa's eyes narrowed, and she snapped, "You think you know everything, don't you?" Before I could respond, James's voice cut in, harsh, angry, and loud. "Mom, enough," he shouted. "Stop disrespecting my wife." I blinked, confused and hurt. What disrespect? I had only spoken kindly. James stood up, his face flushed with anger. I tried to calm him down, telling him I meant no harm, but his eyes were dark with something I hadn't seen before, something I didn't want to believe. And then it happened. James's hand struck my cheek. I staggered back, shock paralyzing me. My heart pounded, and a wave of disbelief washed over me. How could my son do this? How could the boy I raised with love and patience think it was okay to hit his own mother? I looked at him, my voice trembling. Why? Why would you do that? He shook his head, avoiding my gaze. You don't get it. You're always disrespecting Melissa. You treat her like she's not good enough for me. The betrayal hit me harder than the slap. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of disbelief and heartbreak. My son, my flesh and blood, was accusing me of being the enemy. I wanted to scream, to beg him to see reason, but I was too stunned to say anything. The room seemed to close in around me as tears welled up in my eyes. Melissa watched silently, her expression unreadable. After a moment, James turned and left without another word, Melissa following behind him like a shadow. I stood alone, my cheek burning and my heart shattered. That night, I cried until I had no tears left. I questioned everything, my worth, my role in my son's life, even my own sanity. How had love turned into violence? How had respect turned into betrayal? But beneath the pain, a fire began to burn inside me, a fierce determination not to be broken by this cruelty. I realized then that this was a turning point. I could no longer stay silent or accept being treated as less than I deserved. I would fight not with anger or violence, but with truth, dignity, and strength. Because if my own son could hit me for standing up for myself, then I had to stand even taller. After that day, the day my own son hit me, I withdrew from the world. I shut myself away in my quiet house, letting the silence wash over me like a cold tide. The pain wasn't just physical, it was deeper, something that settled heavy in my chest and gnawed at my spirit. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and utterly alone. For days, I barely spoke to anyone. I couldn't face friends or relatives. How could I explain that my own child had struck me? The shame was suffocating, like I'd failed somehow as a mother. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my mind. His angry eyes, the sharpness of his hand, the accusing words. It didn't make sense. How had things gotten so far out of control? I also wondered about Melissa. Was she the poison in this family, the wedge driving a divide between me and my son? I was torn between anger at her and a deep sadness that James had allowed himself to be pulled so far away from me. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I done something wrong? Was I too old-fashioned, too stubborn? Should I have accepted their coldness quietly without standing my ground? The doubts were like a storm inside me, threatening to tear down everything I believed about myself. I thought about my grandchildren too. They were innocent in all this, caught between loyalties. I feared I was losing them as well, that the bond I'd worked so hard to build was slipping through my fingers. But amid the pain, a small voice inside me whispered a different truth. It told me I was not weak, that I was not the villain in this story, that I deserved respect, kindness, and love just like anyone else. Slowly, that whisper grew louder. I realized that silence was no longer an option. I couldn't hide away and hope things would fix themselves. I had to find the strength to stand up for myself, not with anger or bitterness, but with dignity and clarity. I began writing in a journal, pouring out my feelings onto paper. The words helped me untangle the knot of emotions inside me: hurt, fear, confusion, and yes, hope. I wrote about the woman I wanted to be, strong, proud, and unafraid to speak her truth. As the days passed, I started reaching out to old friends, sharing pieces of my story in small, careful ways. Their support reminded me I wasn't alone. They saw me not just as a mother or grandmother, but as a woman with her own worth and value. I also began to prepare myself mentally for the next steps. I knew there would be difficult conversations ahead, maybe even confrontations, but I felt ready to face them, grounded in the knowledge that I deserved respect and that love shouldn't come with conditions or violence. That quiet time of reflection changed me. It strengthened my spirit and gave me the courage I needed to move forward. I realized that sometimes the hardest battles we face are the ones inside ourselves, and winning those battles is what makes us truly free. Though the road ahead was uncertain, I was determined to reclaim my life, my voice, and my dignity. In the quiet aftermath of everything, I reached a turning point, a moment when I knew I could no longer live in fear or silence. The pain and betrayal had left deep scars, but they also sparked something new inside me, a fierce determination to reclaim my life and my dignity. For too long, I had let their coldness and cruelty define my worth. I had tolerated disrespect because I loved my son and wanted to keep the family together. But after the incident, after James hit me, I realized that love should never come with fear or violence. I was no victim, and I refused to be treated like one any longer. I spent hours reflecting on what I truly deserved. It wasn't just respect from my son or his wife, but peace within myself. I knew I had to act, not out of anger or revenge, but to protect my sense of self and to set boundaries that could no longer be crossed. The decision wasn't easy. Part of me worried about what confrontation might bring. Would it push them further away? Would it damage the family beyond repair? But I also understood that silence and submission had already cost me dearly. The price of inaction was too high. So I began to plan. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to say it, and what outcomes I hoped to achieve. I didn't want to burn bridges. I still loved my son deeply, but I needed him to understand that his actions were unacceptable. I wrote down my feelings, my fears, and my demands. I prepared to speak with calm and clarity, not bitterness. I knew that the power wasn't in yelling or blaming, but in standing firm with dignity. At the same time, I started rebuilding my confidence. I reminded myself of all the years I'd spent nurturing and supporting my family. I remembered my own achievements, the struggles I had overcome, and the person I was beneath the pain. That realization, that I was valuable, worthy, and strong, was liberating. It gave me courage. It gave me hope. Slowly, the hurt inside me began to transform into empowerment. I was no longer the scared, silenced woman I had been just weeks before. I was someone who had been through the fire and come out stronger. With that strength came clarity. I knew I didn't have to accept disrespect or abuse to keep the peace. I had the right to demand respect, not just from my son and his wife, but from myself. And so I made a promise. I would no longer shrink to make others comfortable. I would no longer allow my heart to be trampled. I would stand tall, speak my truth, and fight for the peace and dignity I deserved. This was the beginning of my journey back to myself, a journey that would change everything. I never imagined that one phone call could shift the entire balance of my life, but that day it did. After weeks of pain, silence, and gathering my courage, I finally made the call that would change everything. It was early in the morning when I dialed the number for the apartment manager where Melissa and James lived. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was calm, clear, and firm. "Hello," I said. "This is Margaret Allen, James Allen's mother. I need to speak with you about his wife, Melissa Allen." There was a pause on the other end, a moment filled with the kind of surprise I could almost hear through the phone. Then the manager responded cautiously, "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I'm calling to request that Melissa Allen's lease be terminated immediately," I said, "due to circumstances that have severely affected our family. I'm asking you to proceed with her eviction." The words felt strange coming from me, eviction, a serious, almost unforgiving action, but I knew it was necessary. For months, Melissa's coldness, her cruelty, and the damage she was doing to my family had gone unchecked. I wasn't going to sit back and let it continue. The manager's voice betrayed a mixture of shock and curiosity. "Ma'am, this is unusual. May I ask what's going on?" I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't my place to share every detail, but I needed to be clear that this wasn't a petty complaint. "My son's wife has been causing serious harm to our family," I explained gently but firmly. "There have been incidents of disrespect, emotional abuse, and even violence. I can't allow her to continue living there. There was silence on the other end, a silence that felt like the weight of what I was saying settling into the air. Then the manager said, "I understand, Mrs. Allen. I'll begin the process immediately. I'll notify her of the lease termination and handle the paperwork." Relief washed over me like a tide. I felt a rush of power, a reclaiming of control that I hadn't known I'd lost after months of feeling helpless. I was finally taking action. "I appreciate your help," I said. "Please let me know if you need anything else." As I ended the call, a wave of emotions hit me: relief, hope, and a quiet satisfaction. I had stood up for myself and my family in a way I never thought I could. That call wasn't just about eviction, it was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and my power. It was the moment I chose to no longer be a victim, and from that day forward, everything began to change. I hadn't expected my son's reaction to be calm or understanding. When James found out that Melissa's apartment lease had been terminated, his fury exploded like a storm. The news came through a phone call that shattered the fragile silence we'd been holding on to. "Mom, how could you?" he shouted, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. "You don't have the right to do this." I listened quietly, letting his words wash over me without interruption. Inside, my heart ached. This was my son, the boy I raised, the man I loved, speaking to me with bitterness and rage. But I refused to be pulled back into the chaos. My voice remained steady as I replied, "James, I didn't want it to come to this, but I had no choice. Melissa's behavior has torn our family apart, and I can't allow it to continue." He paused, and in that silence, I sensed the turmoil beneath his anger. I could hear the conflict in his breathing, the hesitation that betrayed his love for me despite everything. "You're punishing her," he said finally, quieter now. "You're punishing me." "No," I said firmly. "I'm protecting myself and our family. Respect and kindness are not optional, James. They're the foundation of any relationship." Our conversation continued, tense but honest. He tried to defend Melissa, insisting she was misunderstood. I acknowledged his feelings, but stood my ground, refusing to let excuses justify hurt and disrespect. It was clear the power dynamic was shifting. For years, I had felt powerless, pushed aside by their coldness and cruelty. But now, with calm resolve, I was reclaiming control, not through anger or spite, but through dignity and clarity. James's fury slowly gave way to reluctant understanding. Our confrontation wasn't a victory for either of us, but it was a necessary step toward healing. By the end of that call, I felt a quiet strength settle within me. I had stood firm, and in doing so, I had begun to rewrite the story of our family. After the storm of confrontation with my son, I expected to be left standing alone. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the rest of the world had chosen to turn away from the chaos that had taken root in my family. But slowly, something surprising began to happen. Others started to speak up, to share what they'd been holding inside. At first, it was subtle. A quiet word from my sister during a phone call. "I always thought Melissa was cold, Margie. She never seemed to care about your feelings." Then a nod of agreement from my brother, who admitted he'd witnessed her dismissive attitude during family gatherings. But I didn't want to cause trouble. It was the same from old friends who had watched from the sidelines. One afternoon, over tea, my closest friend said softly, "You didn't deserve how she treated you, and I'm glad you're standing up for yourself." Their words were small, but to me, they felt like lifelines, threads pulling me back from the edge of despair. For so long, I had felt isolated, as if I were the only one suffering. Now, I realized I wasn't alone. Family members who had remained silent or neutral began revealing their own experiences with Melissa's sharp tongue and cold heart. My niece confided that she'd been hurt by Melissa's sneers and dismissals. My cousin shared stories of Melissa's manipulations behind the scenes. Each revelation was like a puzzle piece falling into place. I found comfort in these quiet acts of support. It wasn't about taking sides in a battle. It was about validation, finally knowing that my feelings were real and justified, that I had not imagined the pain or the betrayal. This unexpected community gave me strength. It reminded me that family isn't just about blood or appearances, it's about honesty, respect, and kindness. With their support, I felt my confidence grow. I was no longer the lonely woman isolated by cruelty. I was part of a network of love and truth, a force to be reckoned with. This chapter in my life taught me a powerful lesson. When we dare to stand up for ourselves, others often find the courage to do the same. Together, we can heal wounds and reclaim hope. In that healing, I found a new sense of peace, not because the pain had vanished, but because I knew I was surrounded by those who truly cared. When Melissa received the notice of her eviction, the reaction was immediate and explosive. She stormed through the family like a tempest, hurling accusations and venomous words at anyone who would listen. But beneath the fury, I could see the cracks, the shock of losing the control she'd wielded for so long. For days, the family was engulfed in tension. Conversations became strained, gatherings awkward and silent. Melissa's departure sent ripples far beyond just her absence. It disturbed the uneasy peace we'd all tried to maintain. But as the dust settled, a strange calm took its place. My son James, left without his wife's constant influence, was forced to face the reality he had long avoided. At first, he seemed lost, adrift without the woman who had dictated so much of his life. But slowly, I saw glimpses of the son I remembered before Melissa's arrival, thoughtful, caring, and vulnerable. He began to open up, reaching out in small ways, tentative but genuine. The distance between us started to shrink. Watching this change was bittersweet. I mourned what had been lost in our family's brokenness, but I also felt a deep sense of justice that Melissa's coldness and cruelty had finally been met with consequences. Her departure wasn't just about eviction, it was about reclaiming peace, respect, and love in a family that had been drowning in silence. That day, I realized that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing alone for a time. But in doing so, you create space for healing and hope. The days after Melissa's departure were some of the most difficult we faced, but also the most hopeful. James and I were both wounded, him by the loss of his wife, and me by the betrayal and pain of the past months. Yet in that shared pain, we found the first fragile threads of healing. Our attempts to reconnect were slow and cautious. Neither of us wanted to rush or force what needed time. We began with small gestures, a phone call, a shared meal, a quiet moment that didn't demand too much, but opened a door just a crack. Then came the harder conversations, the ones where the silence broke and truth poured out. "I was blinded, Mom," James admitted one evening, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't see how Melissa was tearing us apart. I didn't stand up for you." Hearing his apology was bittersweet. It stung because it came so late, but it also offered a glimmer of hope. His words were an acknowledgement, the first step toward genuine change. I shared my own feelings too, not as blame but as honesty. "I never stopped loving you, James, but I needed you to see me, really see me, and stand with me." Those conversations weren't easy. Tears were shed, frustrations aired, and mistakes acknowledged. But with every heartfelt exchange, the walls between us crumbled. James began to realize where his loyalties truly belonged, not to the woman who had caused division, but to his mother and the family we had always been. It was a slow, sometimes painful process, but the hope that grew between us was powerful. We were rebuilding not just our relationship, but the foundation of our family. In that hope, I found strength, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there is a chance for renewal, forgiveness, and love. Looking back on everything I've endured, the hurt and betrayal still sting, but they no longer define me. This ordeal, painful as it was, became the crucible that forged a new version of myself, stronger, wiser, and more grounded in my own worth. For so long, I questioned myself, was I too soft? Too proud? Did I somehow deserve the coldness, the disrespect? Those doubts haunted me, but as time passed, I realized those were lies I no longer needed to carry. Regaining my self-respect wasn't a grand moment of triumph. It was a quiet, steady process. Each day, I reminded myself I deserve kindness from others and from myself. I learned to set boundaries, to say no when something didn't feel right, and most importantly, to listen to my own heart. Dignity, I discovered, isn't about power over others. It's about the peace that comes from standing firm in who you are, even when the world tries to knock you down. I embrace the scars, both visible and invisible, as marks of survival rather than weakness. They tell a story of resilience, proof that I refuse to be broken. This journey transformed me from a victim trapped by fear and hurt into a survivor. One who faces life's storms with courage and grace, and in that peace, I found freedom. Freedom from the chains of pain, betrayal, and silence. Freedom to live fully with hope and love in my heart. After the storm of pain, betrayal, and confrontation had passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm, one marked by clarity, respect, and freedom I hadn't known in years. The chaos that once ruled my family's world gave way to something far more peaceful. With my son James, we established new boundaries, not walls built to divide, but lines drawn to protect our hearts and keep us connected with honesty and respect. We learned to communicate with openness, acknowledging past wounds while focusing on the future we wanted to build together. This new chapter wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. In this space, I rediscovered the joy of being a mother and grandmother, free from the tension and cruelty that had shadowed our lives. I could finally cherish the small moments, watching my grandchildren grow, sharing stories with James, and creating memories filled with love instead of fear. The respect I longed for wasn't something I demanded. It blossomed naturally from the new foundation of understanding and care. I felt lighter, freer, as if I'd stepped out of a long, dark tunnel into warm sunlight. This freedom wasn't just about Melissa's departure or the eviction notice I made that call to. It was about reclaiming my place in the family and, most importantly, in my own life. The scars remain reminders of what I endured, but they no longer weigh me down. Instead, they serve as a testament to my strength, a strength that has carried me through heartbreak and into peace. As I look forward now, I embrace this new chapter with hope and gratitude, knowing that even after the darkest storms, there is a chance for renewal, love, and true freedom. As I sit quietly now, reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize how much this journey has taught me about respect, family, and, most importantly, self-worth. Respect isn't something that can be demanded or taken. It must be given and earned through kindness, honesty, and understanding. I learned that no matter how deeply you love someone, you cannot accept being treated with cruelty or silence. True respect uplifts, it doesn't tear down. Family is complicated. It can be a source of joy and pain, strength and heartbreak. But family is also about choices, choosing to stand for what's right, choosing to protect your own heart, and sometimes choosing to walk away from toxic ties to make room for healing. Most of all, I learned the power of standing up for myself. There is a poetic justice in that moment when a woman who was once pushed aside, dismissed, and even hurt physically finally says enough. When I made that call to have Melissa removed from our home, it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about showing myself that I mattered, that I deserved peace. To anyone watching, anyone listening, who finds themselves, those trapped in a similar pain or betrayal, know this. There is strength and dignity. There is power in saying no to disrespect. You are not alone, and you are worthy of love and kindness. This story isn't just mine, it's a message for all of us who have ever felt unheard or unseen. It's proof that even in the darkest times, we can find our voice and use it to bring light into our lives. I close with hope that by sharing my journey, others might find the courage to stand tall, to embrace their worth, and to live freely with their hearts whole. Because in the end, peace isn't just a place, it's a promise we make to ourselves.